Tonight, there is a very specific moment unfolding in Washington, and it begins somewhere far from the Capitol, far from the marble hallways and the closed-door meetings. It begins in Minnesota. Two fatal shootings, carried out by ICE and federal agents. That fact alone is where everything else quietly starts. Those deaths are not background. They are not a footnote. They are the catalyst that sets the entire sequence in motion. And in response to those shootings, Senate Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer, are doing something very deliberate. They are vowing to oppose funding for the Department of Homeland Security. Not delay, not amend quietly, oppose. That decision carries weight because DHS funding is not theoretical. It is tied to a deadline. It is tied to a clock that is already ticking toward the expiration of current federal funding. When that funding runs out, the consequence is not abstract. It is a partial federal government shutdown. So, this is where we are. Fatal shootings in Minnesota, a political response in Washington, and a growing risk that parts of the federal government could soon go dark. Now, what Senate Democrats are saying is not framed as a generic budget fight. Their opposition is directly connected to demands for reforms within the Department of Homeland Security. Reforms. Accountability measures. Those words are doing a lot of work here. They are being used to explain why funding, as it currently stands, is not acceptable. Why simply approving money without changes is, in their view, not something they are willing to do. And that is how a tragic event becomes a legislative standoff. Because in the Senate, funding bills are not just about numbers. They are leverage. They are pressure points. They are sometimes the only way to force attention onto issues that might otherwise move slowly or quietly. The shootings in Minnesota brought immediate attention. The funding deadline brings urgency. Put those two together, and suddenly the risk of a shutdown is no longer distant. It becomes immediate. It becomes procedural. It becomes unavoidable unless something gives. And at this stage, neither side is giving. The Department of Homeland Security sits at the center of this because it oversees agencies like ICE. When actions by agents result in fatal outcomes, the demand for oversight does not stay localized. It moves upward. It becomes institutional. Senate Democrats are saying, in effect, that accountability cannot be separated from funding, that reforms must be part of the conversation before money moves forward. That stance, by definition, increases the likelihood of a shutdown, because funding deadlines do not wait for negotiations to feel complete. They expire whether agreements exist or not. So the risk grows, not because anyone is explicitly seeking a shutdown, but because the conditions for avoiding one are narrowing. This is where the procedural reality matters. Blocking DHS funding is not symbolic. It is operational. It is a concrete action that interrupts the normal flow of government financing. And when that happens close to a deadline, the margin for error shrinks to almost nothing. The phrase partial government shutdown can sound familiar, almost routine. But each time it appears, it comes from a specific chain of events. This one starts with loss of life. It moves through demands for accountability. And it arrives at a standoff over whether money can move without changes attached. There are moments when everything feels suddenly connected, one might say. This is one of those moments. That feeling is not about emotion alone. It is about sequence, about cause and effect lining up in real time. The disagreement is not vague. It is centered on what reforms should be required and what accountability should look like before funding is approved. That disagreement is unresolved. And as long as it remains unresolved, the risk remains in place. This is not a long-term hypothetical. Current funding is set to expire. That expiration date is the hard edge of this situation. It does not move. So tonight, the question is not whether this matters. It is how long the standoff can last before it triggers consequences that affect far more than the people sitting at the negotiating table. The events in Minnesota are fixed. They have already happened. The Senate response is now set into motion, and the clock, quietly, continues to run. This is one of those times when the calendar itself becomes a participant, as someone might quietly observe. The setup is complete, the positions are drawn, the risk is defined. What happens next depends on how that pressure is handled as the deadline approaches. Once the decision is made to oppose funding, the process moves into a different phase. It stops being about statements and starts being about procedure. In the Senate, blocking funding for the Department of Homeland Security is not a rhetorical move. It means votes. It means withholding consent. It means drawing a line that cannot be crossed without negotiation. And that is where the shutdown risk grows sharper. Current federal funding does not extend indefinitely. It has an expiration point. When that point is reached, agencies that are not funded must begin shutting down non-essential operations. That is not a threat. It is the mechanism. So when Senate Democrats say they will block DHS funding, what they are really saying is that they are prepared to let that mechanism engage unless their conditions are met. Those conditions are not abstract. They are centered on reforms and accountability measures tied to the Department of Homeland Security. This is important because DHS is not a small or peripheral agency. It oversees border security, immigration enforcement, and a range of internal security operations. When its funding is in question, the implications extend across multiple parts of the federal government. But the dispute itself is narrowly defined. It is about whether DHS can receive funding without reforms being attached in the aftermath of fatal shootings carried out by ICE and federal agents in Minnesota. That sequence matters. The shootings come first. The demand for accountability follows. The funding opposition is the tool being used to enforce that demand. In Washington, this is a familiar pattern. Funding deadlines often become the moment when unresolved issues are forced into the open. What makes this moment distinct is the proximity between the events in Minnesota and the funding fight that followed. There was no long cooling-off period, no extended review phase. The response was direct and immediate. Senate Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer, made their position clear. They would oppose DHS funding as it currently exists. That clarity removes ambiguity but increases pressure. Because once a position is publicly stated at that level, reversing it becomes harder. It requires not just compromise, but justification. At the same time, the clock does not pause. As the funding expiration approaches, lawmakers are faced with fewer procedural options. Temporary extensions, short-term measures, and last-minute deals all require agreement. Blocking funding narrows those paths. And so the risk of a partial government shutdown grows, not because anyone has declared one inevitable, but because the space for avoiding it is shrinking. This is where the language around reforms becomes central. Reforms imply change. Accountability implies consequences. Those ideas suggest that funding alone is no longer sufficient, that money must be linked to behavior, oversight, and structural adjustments. But reforms take time to define. Accountability measures require negotiation over scope and enforcement. Those processes rarely move quickly, especially under deadline pressure. So what happens instead is a collision between two timelines. One timeline is procedural and unforgiving. Funding expires on a fixed date. The other is deliberative and complex. Reforms and accountability do not resolve themselves overnight. That collision is what produces shutdown risk. From the outside, this can look like dysfunction. But from inside the system, it is often the only moment when leverage exists. Without the deadline, the demand for DHS reforms could stretch on indefinitely. With the deadline, it becomes urgent. That urgency is intentional. It is also dangerous. Because if no agreement is reached, the shutdown mechanism activates regardless of intent. This is why leadership matters in moments like this. Chuck Schumer's role is not just symbolic. As Senate Democratic leader, his pledge to block funding sets the tone for the caucus. It signals unity, it signals seriousness, and it tells negotiators on the other side that this is not a messaging exercise. But leadership also carries responsibility for outcomes. If funding expires without a resolution, the consequences will not be confined to the negotiating room. A partial shutdown affects federal workers, agency operations, and public services. That reality hangs over every conversation. And yet, the underlying disagreement remains unresolved. What specific reforms are required? What accountability measures are sufficient? How are those changes implemented? Until those questions are answered, the funding opposition remains in place. This is the tension at the heart of the situation. The desire to respond meaningfully to fatal shootings. The demand for accountability within a powerful federal department. And the procedural reality of a looming funding deadline. All three are pulling in different directions. There are times when urgency sharpens the truth, someone might quietly say, and times when it sharpens the risk. Right now, it is doing both. The Senate is not yet in shutdown. Funding has not yet expired, but the trajectory is clear. As long as opposition holds and reforms remain undefined, the risk continues to grow. This is not a question of whether the issue will resolve itself. It is a question of when and at what cost. The second section of this story is about pressure. Pressure created by loss. Pressure created by deadlines. Pressure created by decisions that cannot be undone easily. And that pressure is building minute by minute as the expiration date draws closer. Nothing has collapsed yet, but everything is tightening. Fatal shootings by ICE and federal agents in Minnesota have already occurred. Senate Democrats have already pledged to oppose funding for the Department of Homeland Security. And the expiration of current federal funding is no longer distant. It is approaching. This is where consequences stop being hypothetical and start becoming procedural. If DHS funding is blocked and no agreement is reached before the deadline, a partial federal government shutdown becomes the outcome, not the warning. That is not rhetoric. That is how the system is designed to work. What makes this moment especially fragile is that the disagreement is not over whether something happened. The facts are not in dispute. The shootings occurred. The agents involved were federal. The department responsible is known. The disagreement is over what must happen next. Senate Democrats are tying funding to reforms and accountability measures. That linkage is intentional. It is meant to ensure that the response to the shootings is not limited to statements or internal reviews. It is meant to force action. But forcing action through funding opposition carries a cost. That cost is the risk of a shutdown that affects far more than the Department of Homeland Security itself. This is the reality lawmakers are now facing. On one side, there is the argument that funding should not proceed without changes, that accountability requires leverage, that the moment demands more than business as usual. On the other side, there is the procedural truth that funding deadlines do not negotiate. They expire. Once that happens, agencies must act accordingly. Non-essential operations halt. Federal workers face furloughs. Services are disrupted. This is not a punishment aimed at one department. It is a systemic consequence. And yet, the standoff remains. The demands for DHS reforms and accountability measures have not been resolved. The funding opposition remains in place. The deadline remains unchanged. That is where the country is positioned right now. It is important to note what this moment is not. It is not a long-term ideological battle being replayed from previous years. It is not rooted in abstract policy differences. It is rooted in specific events, specific actions, specific outcomes. The shootings in Minnesota created a point of no return. Once lives are lost, the response cannot be purely administrative. That is what has elevated this funding fight beyond routine budget politics. At the same time, the mechanics of government do not bend to moral urgency alone. They require agreement. And agreement at this moment has not materialized. This is where the narrative slows, not because nothing is happening, but because everything that can happen procedurally is now waiting on decisions. Negotiations may continue. Conversations may take place behind closed doors. Proposals may be drafted. But until something changes, the path forward remains blocked. The Senate Democratic pledge is clear. The conditions have been stated. The risk has been acknowledged. And so the situation holds. There is a quiet tension in moments like this. Not the loud drama of floor speeches or press conferences, but the stillness that comes when all parties understand the stakes. Everyone involved knows what a shutdown would mean. Everyone knows how it would be perceived. Everyone knows who would feel its effects first. That knowledge does not automatically produce compromise. Sometimes it produces delay, sometimes it produces last-minute deals, and sometimes it produces exactly what everyone hoped to avoid. Which outcome emerges here depends on whether the gap between funding and reform can be closed in time. As of now, it has not been. The Department of Homeland Security remains unfunded beyond the current deadline unless action is taken. Senate Democrats remain committed to their opposition. The demands for accountability remain unmet. This is not a resolution, it is a holding pattern, and holding patterns are unstable when the clock is still moving. There are moments when the hardest part is not deciding, someone might quietly say, but waiting to see what the decision costs. That sentiment hangs over this entire episode. The shootings in Minnesota cannot be undone. The demand for accountability will not disappear. The funding deadline will arrive whether or not agreement does. Those three truths coexist, and they define the closing frame of this story. There is no dramatic conclusion yet. No vote has ended the standoff. No deal has been announced. What exists instead is a narrowing window. A window in which lawmakers must decide whether reforms and accountability can be addressed without triggering a shutdown, or whether the shutdown becomes the pressure point that forces resolution. Either way, the sequence has already been set in motion. This is where the story pauses, not because it is finished, but because the next development depends on action that has not yet occurred. The risk is real. The positions are firm. The deadline is approaching. And until something gives, the country waits inside that tension, watching the clock move closer to zero. That is where we leave it tonight.